I've been a political advisor and a mediation advisor on Afghanistan and the region and other conflict areas. And my decision to go into this course of work was very much shaped by my experience as a product of a country in conflict. So it's really wonderful to be able to participate in this discussion. And I think it's a particularly compelling time to have this discussion because of the pandemic, parents and children all over the world understand what it is to live with fear, with uncertainty, and with a sense of lack of agency in terms of how your life moves forward. This is the experience of people all over the world in conflict areas, from Syria to Yemen to Sudan to Afghanistan. This is the way people live their lives on a day-to-day basis, where they struggle with a profound lack of agency about decisions that are being made well beyond anything that they can have voice in. Yet at the same time, they need to live their lives day by day and to still forge a future and a perspective and that at least has some sense of hope. And I think that this beautiful film of Angels Are Made of Lights captures that so profoundly and so beautifully. And I'm really honored to be part of this discussion with this distinguished panel, and delighted that we have the director of the film, James Longley, with us, who has made a number of documentaries that speak to this issue, from Gaza, the Gaza Strip, which explores the Second Palestinian Uprising, to his celebrated documentaries, Iraq and Fragments, which was nominated for an Oscar for Best Documentary Feature in 2007, and winner of jury prizes for Best Documentary Directing, Cinematography, and Editing at Sundance Film Festival. And Sari's Mother, which was nominated for an Oscar for Best Documentary Short Subject in 2008, which chronicles the lives of Iraqi people after the 2003 US invasion of Iraq. We also have Sarah Hummel, who has more than 20 years of experience in global development and humanitarian response programming for children and families. She's worked all over the world, and now she leads the global portfolio for Save the Children's Department of Education and Child Protection, including its signature global psychosocial mental health program support for children. And finally, we have Salma Musa, who's the postdoc research fellow and in the Department of Political Science at Stanford University, and who will soon be moving to Yale University as a professor. And she has received a PhD in political science from Stanford University. She's a professor. She's a scholar of comparative politics, and her research focuses on migration, conflict, and social cohesion. Her work has been featured on the cover of Science, The Economist, BBC, Der Spiegel, and the front page of the Times of London, and in the Emmy-nominated episode of PBS Nova. And this discussion comes at a particularly salient time in Afghanistan. For those of you who've been following the situation in Afghanistan, you'll know that February 29th, just last week, was the one-year anniversary of the US-Taliban agreement. This agreement was in some respects seen as a watershed moment that could potentially end the 4 decades of conflict. But a year on, the situation is deemed quite I'm trying to find a word that doesn't say hopeless, but it's been quite grim. The the inter-Afghan negotiations between the Afghan government and the Taliban have not led to a reduction of violence. In fact, it's led to an explosion of violence, and it's led to targeted attacks against civilians, assassination campaigns against those that are seen to be working with the government, which includes anyone such as teachers, journalists, and innocent civilians. And right now, the Biden administration is looking to review its Afghanistan policy and to determine whether it's going to withdraw all US forces from Afghanistan by May. So once again, Afghans are looking at their future very much uncertain in terms of where things will go, whether in a couple of months the Taliban will come back and take over, whether they should pick up their belongings and once again flee to another country, or whether they should, whether there's some hope that peace might be achieved. And these decisions remain outside of any sense of control on their part. The inter-Afghan process only includes 21 people on each side of the party, the table, between 21 on the part of the Afghan government, 21 on the part of the Taliban. And it's not a multi-track process that brings in a diversity of the population like some processes have. And they are left asking questions as to what is the decision that is going to be made on their part for the population. Then many think it's going to be the United States that will make the decision, and a cadre of elites in Kabul. And this is something that the Afghan population tragically have experienced for 4 decades, where they come back to the country, they try to establish their home, they invest, and there's a political upheaval, and once again they have to leave and become refugees. I've known many people who've become refugees multiple times, and their children's education has been disrupted. Their future remains uncertain, but at the same time there's this profound resilience that I find, and Jim, you capture that so beautifully and eloquently in your film, the sense of resilience and hope while there's this looming uncertainty and fear. And you've done this in so many different contexts. You've done this in Palestine, you've done this in Iraq, and you manage in these incredibly politically challenging contexts where the public who pays attention to politics is saturated with the news, yet you are able to really focus in on these human lives and tell a story of lives lived. And what I would love to hear from you is, what are you hoping to convey and these beautiful films that you have masterfully put together? What do you want your audience to walk away with?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me and for showing the film. You know, I made this film really to be like a cinematic environment that the viewer could enter into and experience another place, another culture, another society. And I decided to do this, of course, through the lens of a particular neighborhood in Kabul. And I guess my thinking was, you know, Americans really need to know about Afghanistan, but very few of us will ever travel there. So, you know, what's the solution? As a filmmaker, I can attempt, and I have attempted with this movie, to kind of do a sort of world building exercise where it's not like a traditional film, maybe, where it's focused on the story of an individual and a kind of hero's journey. In this case, I wanted the world of the film to really be bigger than that, and to be, in this case, it's about a neighborhood, and it sort of expands out to be about a city and maybe about a country beyond that. Just to solve this problem of Americans not being able to see inside of a place. I think traditionally, what we mainly get from Afghanistan, you say the news, we're inundated by the news, but what is the news?
Yeah.
The news is mainly about conflicts between armed groups. It's news about political decisions. And these things can be very far from the reality of ordinary people. And so in this film, and really in all of my films that I've made so far, the idea has been to have the audience be closer to and really understand ordinary people and the lives that they're living. And I made all the decisions about where to film and who to film based on the idea that, uh, if an American audience only sees this movie, what's the most accurate portrayal I can make of the society as a whole? So I really tried to film in a neighborhood with a mixed population, and also a population that was somehow representative of the overall economic and educational level in the country, whereas it would have been maybe easier for me to film in a place that was wealthier, or a neighborhood, for example, that had better schools, or but it wouldn't necessarily have been as representative as of the Afghan population as a whole. So yeah, I think different from most films, which really rely on a kind of personal narrative. The whole idea of this film was to have a narrative which is about the society in general, and not about the United States, because mainly what you see, I think, in the United States from Afghanistan are films about United States soldiers, other foreign soldiers. There's Armadillo, Restrepo, all of these uh, films that have been distributed in the United States, To Hell and Back Again. These are all really films about American soldiers, as if the only way that we can see Afghanistan is through the eyes of an American soldier and sort of down the barrel of a gun. And I'm really against this in Afghanistan and in the other places I filmed, Iraq, Gaza. I really think the only worthwhile view to have is a view of civilian life.
Thank you. And this one, what's exceptional is that you focused on the lives of children and in a school setting, which tells a story that's even more rarely told. I wanted to get a sense of why you made that choice.
Well, I chose a school in this case, but I actually looked at a bunch of different possibilities. I looked at hospitals as well, other kinds of places, because I was really looking for a sort of walled garden type of environment where where it was practical to film. On the one hand, really, I wanted to film a family, you can say. But to film a family, an individual family in Afghanistan, puts a lot of pressure on them, because then you're a foreign filmmaker who's being allowed into a family's house, and their neighbors will talk. And if the Taliban does take over again, everyone will point at this family and say, this is the family that let the American filmmaker into their house. And so in order to avoid putting this kind of real social pressure on an individual family, I chose to film in a school, because it has in some ways the same kind of dynamic of the parents are the teachers and the students are the children, and it becomes like a big extended family, if you like. And so it was kind of a substitute for what I would really have liked to have done. But it's also very practical, because when you're filming in a school, it's a semi-public space. And if you have permission from the different ministries and from the principal, then your access as a filmmaker is not too difficult. And a school is not considered something that's controversial or political by most people. And so it's just easier to get over the various problems that can exist being an American filming in a country at war, in conflict. But at the same time, it has the advantages of, there are hundreds of children, and, probably, 70 different teachers. And so there's an opportunity to find the right people to film, or the people who will allow you to film them. Yeah, it's practical. And then also, in the case of children, I just think that it's easier for an international audience to be introduced to a strange environment that they are afraid of through the eyes of children, because then it sort of gives you this subliminal message the whole way through that, if a child can be in this environment, then so can you know what I mean? And you can see the world through their perspective, and it's not frightening as much, because you realize that, children are enduring this environment. Children are living here.
Yeah.
Therefore, it's less of a barrier. And I just think we have a tendency to have more empathy for children than for adults, for whatever biological reason. I think that's just a fact of human nature.
Thank you. Sarah, the film really, because it gives agency and voice to these children to tell their own stories in terms of what they're thinking, what weighs upon them. So it really gives you a sense of the impact of conflict on children. And you've worked in many different conflict areas. And I wanted to hear a little bit more about your experience in terms of how conflict impacts children psychologically. So I want to start off with that, just to get a little bit of your perspective.
Sure. Thanks, Rina. So today, there are more than 400 million children living in conflict-affected countries around the world. That's nearly 1/5 of all children in the world. And over the last decade, grave violations against children in conflict have more than doubled. Grave violations are things such as the recruitment and use of children as soldiers, killing and maiming of children, sexual violence, abductions, attacks on schools or hospitals, and the denial of humanitarian access, such as food, water, and medicine. So if we think about what children are experiencing in conflict around the world today, children are being killed, they're being injured, they're witnessing the killing and maiming of others, including family, friends, or other loved ones. Their schools are being attacked. They might not have enough food to eat, or access to clean water, or access to healthcare and other life-sustaining supports. Millions of children are living in conflict that goes on for months or even years. And this type of stress is extreme. It is prolonged, and therefore it is toxic. Long-term exposure to such extreme stress not only causes an immediate impact to the mental health and psychosocial well-being of children, it can also interrupt their physical and mental development and lead to both physical and mental health consequences in later life, such as higher rates of mental illness and heart disease in adulthood. But as you said in the intro, there is still light in these settings. There is hope and resilience. There are wonderful people who support children in so many ways. There are amazing children and adults who support each other, who show compassion and understanding and help foster empathy and make children's lives better in such difficult situations every single day. And luckily for me, that's a lot of what I am exposed to through the work at Save the Children and our partner organizations around the world.
Thank you, Sarah. Could you talk a little bit more about the work that you do? I know that Save the Children is doing some really impressive interventions to support children in conflict, particularly psychosocial programming.
Sure. So Save the Children has quite a diverse mental health and psychosocial support portfolio that works across multiple sectors and between sectors. So things that we do in health, in education settings, in child protection or social work contexts. This year is actually the 10th anniversary of one of our signature programs. It is a psychosocial support program called HEART, which stands for Healing and Education Through the Arts. This is a classroom or center-based program, which was also recently adapted into a home support model because many children are at home due to COVID-19 around the world. And in lockdowns, children are unable to access school or community centers or places where they would normally attend our regular programming. So this specific program, the HEART program, it uses expressive arts to help children to communicate, to express themselves, both through arts activities such as drawing, painting, sculpture, drama, storytelling, music, but also through verbal communication. So we have both an art making element and a supportive sharing circle where children come together with trained adult facilitators, such as teachers or community center facilitators, and together they share their artwork, they share their experiences, their ideas, their feelings in this group setting. And the emotional support that they receive and are able to give to each other by sharing, by listening to others. Through this process, children gain an understanding of themselves and of those around them. They learn that they have both unique and common experiences. They learn that their feelings and emotions are normal and okay. And this process of understanding both the self and others develops empathy. So children become bonded and supportive of each other, and empathy becomes a core part of everyday life in a classroom, in a school, in a community center, wherever children are able to gather and engage in this type of psychosocial support programming. And this is the 10th year anniversary of this program, and we have just reached the milestone of reaching more than 1 million children around the world. In addition to this program, Save the Children supports children and families through many other means, especially when it comes to mental health and psychosocial support, through community health programming and community-based social work case management. We help link children and families with specialized support services, not only to address mental health needs, but also broader health, nutrition, education, and protection needs in conflict-affected communities.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So you touched on. Sorry, I'm getting an echo. One of the things that you've touched upon is empathy, and Jim, I'm going to turn to you for this question. Now, the concept of empathy has become very popularized, and I certainly in the conflict resolution field is something that we increasingly talk about. And the most powerful medium for empathy, as many say, is film. But at the same time, there's a sense that there's almost a saturation of empathy and sort of compassion fatigue or empathy fatigue as viewers become increasingly exposed to the brutality of war. This certainly came up in discussions around Syria. How do you, as a filmmaker, work to overcome that? Or how do you transcend that and really still tap into empathy as a means of connection?
Well, I know that there's this narrative that says, people are tired of being empathetic, and empathy makes people exhausted, in essence. But I actually don't agree with this. And maybe, I don't know, maybe there are people who study empathy scientifically who will, prove me wrong empirically. But I actually think the opposite is true. I think the thing that is exhausting, certainly to me and to other people I know, is a lack of empathy rather than empathy. For example, I think if you look at the last 4 years in politics in the United States, the most exhausting thing is to be, ruled over by someone who lacks empathy and understanding. And on the contrary, I think empathy is the thing that gives energy and that gives warmth, and it's the absence of empathy, which is which is cold and lifeless and exhausting. I really believe that, and I just don't buy into this theory that that people are incapable, that people only have so much empathy to give, and then they're exhausted and they don't have any more. I think that what people are maybe confusing something else with this idea of empathy being exhausting, and maybe that's a kind of cognitive dissonance between, in general, what our society tells us that we should care about, which is ourselves and making money and all of these things, which are maybe not really true, and the thing that we understand really to be true, which is that we have to care about others, maybe before ourselves, and that this is the most important thing in life. I think that we know that this is true, and somewhere in our early childhood probably we were taught that, but then we're also confronted by this other reality of society, which is kind of the opposite message. And I think it's the cognitive dissonance of what we're told, maybe subliminally, by our society, and what we know as human beings to be accurate. I think this is where the exhaustion actually comes from, not from empathy or any of the things that that we know are good and that actually give us positivity and feelings of love and belonging and meaning in life.
Thank you. And I'm going to turn to Salma now, because Salma, you've done really groundbreaking work in this area in terms of both the promise empathy and some of its limitations. And I would love for you to be very frank with us on all fronts.
Sure. Firstly, it's just an absolute pleasure to be here, and I just really appreciate the kind of work that went into this film. And maybe one thing we haven't all considered is that this film itself is an empathy building tool. It's the kind of thing I would prescribe for every American to watch. And one of the reasons why I think it's powerful is for many of the reasons why empathy interventions in many settings tend to be positive or successful. One, that it undermines stereotypes. So this is really important when you're facilitating any kind of contact across group lines or trying to reduce prejudice. It's important that that contact or that experience undermines negative stereotypes. A second is that it's humanizing. So it shows complexities. It doesn't kind of repeat these depictions of people as being having very simple emotions or not being able to experience the full range of things like sorrow. So not just are they happy or sad, but they can feel sorrow or hopeful. Like those are secondary emotions that are not always attributed to outgroups who are stigmatized. Another reason is that that empathy works, and I think this film does the same thing, is that the people you come into contact with, or even if they're fictional, even if you're just reading a book about someone or watching a movie, it's important that they're seen as somewhat typical or somewhat representative. Because what you don't want is someone to like watch a movie or read a book or do an empathy exercise, and then at the end of the day they say, "Oh, but this person is an exception. This one friend I have, this Afghani friend, Rina, is an exception. Most Afghani people are not like Rina." So you don't want that kind of mental fence to be built around the people you are exposed to that stop you making these more positive generalizations about the group. And one way to do that is to make sure that the people you come into contact with or you're exposed to are seen as regular people. And so I think that's something this film does really, really beautifully. And finally, it's important that empathy or intergroup contact interventions, there's not as much research about this, but my evolving view is that it's important that they're not political. It's important that they're not polarizing. It's important that this is not like a red or blue issue, or we're not giving, I guess, credence to various political ideologies. It's just a purely human story. And you want to just take away all the reasons people might have to not empathize with something. And framing and partisan cues is a really big thing. And so I think removing the backdrop here is education. It's something completely apolitical. Things like sports, music, that they have that same benefit. So those are why empathy interventions tend to be successful. But now I'll give you the flip side, the more cynical side. So empathy is a powerful tool, but we have to really think about the scale of these interventions and how powerful they are given the countervailing forces that people experience when they walk out of the classroom, when they walk out of the movie theater, when they finish the book. So this kind of approach is great at the individual level. I think it can improve everyday interaction. But what we really have to ask ourselves is, what are the roots of this conflict? What are the roots of prejudice? What are the structural factors that have caused this situation in the first place? So if there is an active conflict that's going on, if there are still troops that are deployed, if there's residential segregation, if there's political entrepreneurs who are stoking ethnic tensions, if people are experiencing violence on a regular basis, the weight of those structural factors and the importance of policy tools to fix them can just be enormous compared to these more targeted individual level approaches. And this is especially the case with children, actually. So kind of moving back to the idea of building empathy in children. The question is, can we really build resilience to these big shocks that happen around them? And this is especially concerning given that children are super sensitive to social norms and to their environment, like even more so than adults. So the good side of that is that they're quite malleable. But the flip side of it is that, once they step out of the classroom and their parents start speaking a certain way, or they see things on the news, they're going to be quite quickly socially conditioned into thinking that some groups are good or bad, for example. So I think these are the limitations, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't be doing this important work and building these pockets of resilience. But the question for me is, what is the impact of these kinds of programs in relation to the other structural forces that people are experiencing? So we have to do those things together. You need the grassroots interventions and the policy tools to reinforce each other and to create a more sustainable cycle of peace or more positive intergroup relations.
Thank you. I'm so glad that you took the discussion to where I was hoping we would go, which is because you've worked in so many different contexts. You've looked at social tensions in the UK and a number of different countries all over the world, including Syria, and you've looked at American school children, and you're pointing to a few things that are generalizable across settings. Now, I'm just going to bring the conversation back to the US, and then I'm going to move back to Afghanistan, where the US right now is seen as it's at its most polarized. And as you rightly note, it's not something that can just be approached at the grassroots level. It has to be at the policy level. But these grassroots, and there are so many groups right now that are trying to do intergroup dialogue and social cohesion and empathy building. Are there ways to anchor those experiences more at the local level, at the community level, to increase their impact?
So I think there's a few things that we can do to make these programs more impactful. Perhaps the most important one is to get the support of norm leaders or opinion leaders. So I think when people think, okay, me walking into this program, this is something that is approved by people whose opinions I care about. So it's really important to understand, what is the media landscape? What is the social landscape? Where are people getting messages from? What are the social norms like? Are these activities okay or not okay? That can really go a long way in encouraging people to actually participate in these kinds of intergroup dialogue programs, for example, and B, to actually make them more effective and more on a more long-term level, that these kinds of norms are moving in the right direction. More broadly, I think the kinds of tools that we've seen generally be positive are things like positive intergroup contact. Things like perspective-taking interventions, so empathy building, vicariously putting yourself in the shoes of a Syrian refugee, for example, through a video game or through reading a vignette. Another bucket of interventions has to do with increasing self-other overlap. So how do you empathize? Is there some shared ground? And so two types of shared identity or shared experiences that have been found to be positive in reducing prejudice are first, when it comes to immigrants, your family's own history of immigration. So reminding people to think that they were at one point immigrants makes them more tolerant of immigrants today. And the other is if they have actually gone through a war experience, or if there's a history of experiencing war in their own families, reminding people of that kind of unlocks a different part of the brain where it's almost like there is some trauma involved in it. But what it does is it increases this idea that we have some shared ground. We've experienced something similar. Oh, my family went through the Korean War a couple of generations ago, or I have this relative who's in Afghanistan. And then they start thinking, oh, well, these people weird. That's happened in my family not that long ago. So that family history of immigration or going through war, or that personal exposure to war. I mean, I know Sarah outlined all of the terrifying reasons why war is horrible for children. But one maybe silver lining for adolescents or for adults is that that kind of experience tends to make people more accepting of peace processes and resolving the conflict. Like they have war fatigue and they're tired of it. So in some settings, war can really entrench group divisions. In others, that war exposure can actually make you more likely to come to the table and to just drop it and puts things in a different perspective. So I say those are the main buckets: that intergroup contact, empathy, or perspective taking, which can be done through a lot of different media. And the third is stressing what you have that's shared in your identity, which can come from family history or personal history.
Thank you, Salma. That's really illuminating. I wish we had an hour just to focus on your findings and your research. I'm going to ask the final question to Jim, and then I will ask you to reflect on closing remarks for all the panelists. Jim, you hone in on the ethnic divisions in Afghanistan that have been forged during the 4 decades of war, and that manifest themselves in so many aspects of life. And it's something that the children are quite keenly aware of. And I wanted to get your thoughts on how it's reinforced and how the children find ways to transcend it. What were your what insights did you gain?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of things to say here, and maybe more than we have time for. But you know, as far as the intergroup conflict, when I made the film, of course, my idea was that the intergroup conflict that I was trying to really get at was really the conflict, you could say, between the United States and Afghanistan itself. And this idea that a lot of Americans have in their mind that, you know, this is the other, the foreigner, somehow less than, frightening in some ways. I wanted to get at these fears that you can also find between groups who are very close to each other. This kind of, I guess Sigmund Freud called it the narcissism of small differences, which is, you know, when he was referring to the phenomenon of people who are actually very similar to each other, living next to each other, but are nonetheless finding these small things to differentiate themselves and to find fault with. But, you know, I also wanted to, in this film, make it clear to Americans that the narrative, the simple kind of, you know, American armed forces versus Taliban or, you know, whatever, that this narrative is not really the narrative which is central to most Afghans about their country, and that the United States is just jumping in to a very complicated internal narrative of Afghanistan. From time to time, you know, with our support for the Mujahideen, or now with our support again for a completely different group of people, which also contains Mujahideen. But you know, I wanted Americans to have a sense of this complexity, and that it wasn't a simple idea that was going on in Afghanistan. And I wanted to show also that even the children in Afghanistan are thinking about this complexity and solutions to the problems that they have internally, and that really, you know, there are limits to what the United States can really achieve politically in Afghanistan, because we're foreigners and we don't really understand necessarily everything that's going on there. And I think there's a tendency for Americans, especially, to view ourselves as a kind of world police force and this, a kind of world savior and a country that can step in and interject ourselves into a foreign conflict or a foreign country and decide things for those people. And I think it's quite arrogant. So there's that, but I guess, the bigger idea that I had was simply to let Americans kind of have a healthy way of thinking about Afghanistan, which is really thinking about the problems and the concerns of civilians within that country and seeing it from their point of view, empathetically, if you like. And so, this was the main idea that I had, that instead of seeing Afghanistan as a simple thing that we were kind of in charge of and that we could sort of take on or discard at will, that Afghanistan was its own ongoing complex narrative of millions of people, and that we should regard it as such, with this feeling of respect for the problems of other people and the concerns of other people.
Thank you very much, James. I'm going to turn to Sarah and ask for the closing remarks to come back to the issue of children and some solution-oriented ideas that we might give our audience in terms of what they can support, what they can be thinking about as they move forward in terms of engaging positively on this issue of children in conflict. Thank you.
Thanks, Rina. So I think we're sharing a few links right now to some resources at Save the Children. Save the Children currently works in more than 100 countries. Many of these countries are affected by conflict, either because of conflict within the country itself or conflict in neighboring countries, which creates refugee crises. In all of these settings, Save the Children is committed to supporting the health, education, and protection of children. And as part of that commitment is expanding our work to support the mental health and psychosocial well-being of children. And we're reaching more and more children and families affected by conflict around the world. We have a specific initiative that focuses on 10 countries in particular where children are most severely affected by conflict. This includes Afghanistan, Central African Republic, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Iraq, Mali, Nigeria, Somalia, and South Sudan. And so you can see in the links, you can link to these initiatives, to the 10-country focus, or to our broader programming that is supporting more than 100 children in more than 100 countries around the world. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Salma, anything more that you would want to add in terms of addressing, you've said so many given rich recommendations, addressing intergroup polarization and conflict, and if you could tell every member of the audience of something that they should thinking about doing, what would that be?
I'd say if you have control over any kind of space in your life, whether it's a book club or a video game, I don't know, that you play with other people, or if you're a teacher, really any space where people are interacting either virtually or in person that you're a part of, try to think through how you can design those interactions to be as positive as possible, especially if it's something that's not political at all. If it's something based on a hobby or a shared interest, or you're in a classroom together, how can we get people to understand where others around them are from in a way that says, hey, we're different and that's okay, but we also have these similarities and we know how to work together and we have these common goals in life, especially if they have a shared hobby, it makes it easier. So just think, how can I do my little part in my area, in my community, in my classroom, in my soccer team to try to facilitate positive interactions between people, especially given that those spaces at that very local level, for a lot of people, that might be the only time they ever interact with someone from another culture, whether it's virtually through a movie or not. So to really think about your impact in that way.
Thank you very much. And finally, James, you've said so much in terms of what you want your audience to draw, and you've talked, I think you've alluded to the humility that Americans and others need to adopt in approaching conflict areas. Is there anything more that you want to say on this subject, or more broadly as your last closing remark? I think you.
Yes. Well, I would just say that I would just continue the idea that I had earlier, which is that that there really isn't some kind of exhaustible supply of empathy that people have. I think it really is something which is inexhaustible, and the more of it that we have, the more of it there will be, in a way. And I mean, more broadly, I guess, when I look at humanity as a whole, I sort of see empathy as a central issue that we have to overcome, really, in order to solve all of these issues that we have, not only around armed conflict, but the way our society works in general, the discrimination against various groups, the economic disparities, and how we've decided to structure our world and our interactions between people based on things other than empathy. I think this is problematic, and I would like to see a trend in the other direction, where value is placed on empathy more than value is placed on money, for example. I think this is a leap that human beings are capable of making, and we just have to use our imaginations to figure out how.
Thank you so much, and apologies to the audience for running a little bit over. But as you can see, we have just panelists that I think we could listen to all day, and that their presentations were very illuminating. Thank you very much, and I'm going to turn to Beta to make closing remarks. Thank you.
You're on mute.
Thank you. Thank you all very much for joining us today. I was supposed to introduce, but we had some technical difficulties, so I'm actually even happier that I'm closing and had a chance to listen to what everyone had to say and how much it aligns with what we're trying to build with this Humankind movement. This was the first of our of many upcoming empathy building and awareness initiatives that are going to be part of the Humankind movement. And our goal, thank you, James, for sharing our vision. But our goal is to embed empathy into our everyday lives. We know that this is certainly going to take a lot of time, especially given the situation that the world is in today. But we are absolutely reassured by all of the research that has shown that empathy is a learned behavior, and it can be taught and honed over time. And our central thesis for Humankind is that with greater empathetic behavior toward one another, and also, the world around us as well, I think the relationship that we have with our environment, we need to do a lot better to educate at a very young level the relationship that we have with nature. That with this greater understanding of one another, of the world around us, that we can begin to shape, again, over time, a more resilient and just future. We just need to be able to understand and share that experience of others, and that needs to be learned, right? It is not something that is coming naturally to the majority of people. And there are some very fascinating case studies that we are looking at. And to Salma's point, it's not just about the awareness and education of empathy building and of empathy, but it needs to be matched with some serious systemic change and some policies to back it up. And we are exploring, as part of our work, the way in which some countries, especially Denmark, are initiating curricula at a very young age for empathy building. So today we focused on film as part of the Humankind experience, and we are so grateful to James for his extraordinary work with Angels Are Made of Light. But in future programming, and I hope that everyone will be able to share that with us in the future, we're going to be looking at our collective experience through art and through music. And we'll be supporting empathetic behavior through mutual aid, empathy interventions, and trainings. And through our investment arm, looking at some really innovative businesses and projects that are really lifting the quality of life of people around the world and are going to be investing through an empathy lens. I want to thank our great collaborators and partners at Save the Children. They have been wonderful to work with, and hope that we will be able to do a lot of other wonderful things as we grow the movement. So thank you, and we welcome all of you to Humankind.